Hello and welcome to the defense of my PhD thesis on smallholder farm and farmer diversity. Before I start diving into the contents of my thesis, I would like to explain you what's going on here on stage, who is who. So this is me, and these are my paronyms, Skotja and Walter. And the opponents will be sitting there and they will be asking me questions. And then the promoter and co-promoter, so my professors, will sit there, together with the Deputy Rector Magnificus, who will chair the session. The time schedule, I have around 13 minutes now to give my presentation, and then the opponents have 45 minutes to ask me questions. They will withdraw to discuss whether I performed well or not, and that means for us that we have a short break. And then the committee will come back and we have 15 minutes, and they have 15 minutes to give the final presentation, and we will see what happens then. Smallholder farm systems, so I have written my thesis about that. Why are they important? Because 83% of all global farm systems are actually smallholder farm systems. And a narrative is that they could be more productive if they would adopt improved technologies and techniques. Now, I have collaborated with a project called Africa Rising. Africa Rising is all about sustainable intensification, and they have done lots of experiments. And I evaluated 5 of their technology packages. So what do I mean when I talk about technology packages? These are good practices around growing crops like maize, cowpea, soybean. Then there's a rotation of maize and a legume, and a strip crop of maize and a legume. So strip crop means that you have several rows of maize and then several rows of a legume. And each of these technology packages has a technology and a technique component. What do I mean with technology? Technologies are inputs that you have to buy, like fertilizer and seeds, or spray, or inoculum, like a rhizobium on the soybean. And techniques are more managerial, like planting the crops in rows and specific crop spacing, and incorporating green manure into the soil for better soil fertility. So these are the technology packages that I'm talking about later during my presentation. And my first question was, so for whom are these packages actually useful? I'm asking for whom because we were already aware that there are different farm households. And we had household survey data, and I used statistical techniques in order to group the households into kind of homogeneous clusters. So I found that there are, for example, low, medium, and high resource endowed households. And that meant that there were households that had little land and few animals and rather small household sizes, and then others that had relatively more. So that's what I got from the statistics, and this is my chapter 2 of the thesis. But then I also wanted to ask farmers in the communities how they perceive diversity. And I asked that very structured. I asked women and men separately, and I selected men and women from different types of households in order to get a diversity of impressions. But instead of grouping households, they were saying that individuals are the ones that are different. For example, the male household head, usually high resource endowed, and the son, for example, if he's old enough, he would be medium resource endowed, and the wife would, or the other women of the household would be rather low resource endowed because they don't own any land. They have less resources and more difficult access to resources. So this is the chapter 3 of my thesis. So in conclusion, I found that there are different types of households and different types of household members. And this is the starting point for my thesis, so that's why my thesis is entitled On Farm and Farmer Diversity. And I used this framework to evaluate which technology packages work for what type of farm and for what type of farmer. And that's basically the chapter 4 of my thesis. So that means we're already half through my thesis right now, which is good news. And I used this framework for my data collection. So I went to 3 different sites of Africa Rising, one in the northern region, one in the Upper East, one in the Upper West region. And for each of the communities that I selected per region, I selected a representative household of each type, so a low, medium, and a high resource endowed household. And per household, I also then consulted different household members, usually the male household head, the wife, and oldest son or daughter. So I had 24 observations. And why did I ask these 3? Because actually I asked in the community, whom do I have to ask to get a good insight into diverse opinions and to people who influence the decision? And they told me, ask the household head, the oldest son or daughter and the wife, they are like the 3 stones under a cooking pot. And what they meant was that they are the social fundament of households. So what I did, I wanted to know how did these technology packages perform at household level. I used the farm model, and I looked how profitable are these technology packages, how much labor input, and how much was the impact on soil organic matter. And I asked the same to the individual household members, but I also asked additional criterion, for example, the ease of application and the grain quality and other criteria. And I used the weighted scoring technique for that. That means that these different criteria could be differently important for different people within the household, and they could indicate that, and then score the different technology packages according to that. So I got a really nuanced insight into what people were appreciating and also what the model was saying about them. So the main findings, to keep it extremely simple, the model said 2 things: that poor households basically benefit most, and that is in relative terms, not in absolute terms, and that if you want to increase your profit, you also usually have to put in more labor. And then when I asked the farmers, they said, yes, you can actually, these profitable farm configurations are correctly determined, but the investment cost is too high, we cannot reach it. And there's a labor constraint for us to make this happen. And this is, of course, mainly true for low and medium resource endowed households. Women were also found to be more positive than men about the technology packages. And we could differentiate between techniques and technologies. As I said, techniques are more management practices. So you don't need to invest anything except your labor and making changes in your behavior. So that is very interesting for low and medium resource endowed households. While technologies, you have to purchase them, at least according to my definition, and so it's more affordable, accessible to high resource endowed households. So what can we learn about adoption from this? So we saw that there are different interests within a household, and the household also shares certain resources like land and labor. So how does this translate into a decision? I think what was missing was the power dimension, like how much influence did the people have with their different interests? So the next 2 chapters of my thesis, chapter 5 and 6, are about household level decision making. Of course, I have very complicated models about that, but I just want to show you the main results that I found. It actually looked like the decision outcome at household level was only reflecting the preference of the household head, the male household head. At the same time, people that I've consulted within the household, they reported separately from each other that not only household head had a power, had an influence on the decision, but also the son, for example, and the wife. So there was a mismatch. And in order to understand that, I set up a serious game in order to simulate a negotiation. So as I was inviting 5 household heads, 5 wives, and 5 oldest sons, and I gave them all the same task. You should be part of a medium resource endowed household. This is the amount of land you have, land quality, and these crops. And please go into own groups and think how you would allocate the land for the household. And after they did that, a spokesperson per group sat together, and they were acting as if they were a household. And I filmed that, and I analyzed what was the decision outcome compared to their individual preferences. And afterwards, I asked all the participants, not just the spokesperson, but also those observing, how satisfied they were with the decision outcome for their group and who they thought had most of the power. And the main findings of the game is that indeed, the household level outcome was a compromise. It was not just the preference of the household head. So the other household members also had an influence in the game. And interestingly enough, it was also more profitable and more nutritious than what the household head would have suggested, or the household heads. And I found that the wives and the sons had an influence, although the household head indeed seemed to be the strongest, hold the strongest power position. I also asked the participants individually, like how the game, what we saw, was relating to what they experienced in their own households. And they said that it's really similar. So it seemed like the game was quite close to what was actually happening in households. And I had the feeling from that before in the earlier survey that I've done. So what I found is actually, if you hold power, you can use it. You could be overruled, but you can also withhold it. In some cases, you might not gain enough in order to enter a situation where you're risking a conflict. But even if you withhold your power, it could still have an importance in time and across decision domains. I'll give you an example. If we are negotiating something and you want to grow maize and it's not my interest, well, maybe eventually I get my will on something else, even if that's not exactly on this decision. So in the end, my power is still somewhere. My overall findings of this thesis, I think through considering farm and farmer diversity in this systematic manner, I think we gain new insights on the technology packages, but also how decisions come about at household level. And even though we're looking at complex systems where not everything is linear and you cannot split it up all the time into small parts and understand it without the context, you can find meaningful patterns like the typologies, for example, and also the way that decision-making functions at household level. And if we talk about the pathway out of poverty, for example, for low-resource endowed households, we have to be aware that this pathway probably involves a sequence of different steps, and each step might be negotiated at household level, and it's quite complex. There are many people involved, so maybe we can understand why development is sometimes slower, or we have to talk about equity and equality here as well. We have to consider, though, because we are looking at complex systems and it's not our lives, that non-adoption of a technology might be the best choice for a farmer. And if it's not the best choice, maybe it's limited by constraints, and then we have to look at the enabling environment. Maybe things like microcredits could help them to access technologies and techniques or technologies mainly, that they would be interested in. So what about research recommendations? I think we should explore the higher levels again, because I really went down from the region to the household and into the household. So now I think we should lift it back up, but I didn't have the time for that in my thesis. But it matters, community dynamics and markets, for example. And also the topic of youth and agriculture. So I have included young men and women in my surveys. But for example, the project I think could do much more with it. And often nobody really knows so much what to do with them. So it could be more systematically included, since they also shape household level decision making. And then the last point, when we ask about the transferability of my findings, I would suggest that we go through a sequence of steps in order to ensure responsible scaling, because even if I have statements about these communities, it might not be directly transferable to other farm communities. So I would like to thank you, and also thank you for being here. And we still have 2 minutes until the committee arrives. So yeah, we can just wait for a moment.
Please be seated. I hereby open this ceremony convened by the Academic Board of Wageningen University in which Mirja Michalscheck is offered the opportunity of defending a thesis with propositions entitled On Smallholder Farm and Farmer Diversity. The defense will take place before an examining committee appointed by the academic board as a prerequisite for conferring the degree of doctor. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to welcome you all to this graduation ceremony. My name is Erwin Bult. I'm the professor of development economics here in Wageningen. I'm also a member of the academic board, and in that capacity will represent the Rector Magnificus today. I'd like to call on the first examiner to start the opposition, and the first examiner is Professor Lewis, Professor of Knowledge, Technology and Innovation at this university.
Thank you, Mr. Rector. Respected candidate, I've thoroughly enjoyed reading your dissertation. I think it gives us a very interesting picture of farm diversity, and I think it's methodologically very rich in its ranges from, household surveys to observations of nonverbal communication, games, modeling, etc. It's really a very nice combination of work. My first question is about, I think it's chapter 3, where you develop and compare different farm typologies and look at the relationships. And what strikes me actually is that these typology, both the ethic and the emic, can still be described in rather similar categories in fact you put them in a table, 3.4 on page 82, I think. You actually able to quite nicely link them together and describe them into similar categories related to age and size and wealth and, those kinds of things. Which may be a little bit suspicious, about how emic these perspectives really are. I would send in an anthropologist who speaks the local language, I would probably get, typologies maybe related to ethnic beliefs or the meaning of life, the relationship with the ancestors and the relationship with soil and how that all diverges. So how confident are you that you have arrived at an emic perspective really?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your words and for your first question. I think your concern is valid, since we're coming in as obviously foreigners, and maybe we are also shaping their answers according to what farmers think we want to hear to some degree. I think, however, so for us it was very surprising that they grouped individuals. We expected that they would group households, and that gives me a first indication, the fact that we are surprised that we were not too pre-formed, like on our side. It's always difficult to know what is happening on the other side as well, of course. We also found categories that were not at all identified through the statistical typology. For example, the landless farmers, the seasonal workers that come in, and yet they were considered to be a separate type of farmer.
and sort of northern Ghana is an ethnically diverse community, so you didn't find any sort of differences along those lines?
Well, in this case, this participatory typology was only done in the northern region, so not in the 3 region, which is all Dagomba. So that maybe explains why they were rather similar in this case. I can imagine, however, that there might be differences in other ethnic communities.
Okay. So you did a lot of work on typologies, and the implicit idea behind it, or maybe even explicit, is that these typologies help in targeting something, interventions or some kind. Now, I've been struggling with that myself, because you can describe diversity in farming communities in an infinite number of ways, using all sorts of variables. And I recently had a chat with one of your colleagues, Professor Giller, and he sort of said, I've given up on making typologies. I don't think they're useful. I think what we should be doing is, providing people baskets of options, make sure that these baskets are diverse enough, and then people will self-select. So how useful is it actually in the end to invest so much time in doing that work?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a very valid question as well, I think. So in our case, I think what we have gained, for example, differentiating low, medium, and high resource endowed household, for a project that's called Africa Rising and being embedded in Feed the Future, you want to target those that are food insecure. So in our case, we could differentiate like we could understand a little bit more whom we're actually looking at, what are their concerns, their needs, and their problems. So I think getting a more differentiated picture also helps to understand what are the demands on the farmer side and on whom you like selecting a subgroup maybe eventually. And about the baskets that you're talking about, you still need to know whom you are.
The basket is for.
Come from somewhere.
Okay. Let's shift to chapter, I think it's 6. I'm a little bit puzzled by the last parts of chapter 6 on page 190, I think. The last sentence, somehow we conclude that serious gaming has served well to uncover dynamics in farmland allocation. But if I look a little bit higher up the page, then you say, we think that the real-life interplay of interests and power positions may look very different than in our game, depending on the prevailing negotiation culture. So what have we now really learned about what happens in the real? Are these statements not contradictory?
They are not. But what I meant with the statement that it may look very different in different communities or settings. I think, for example, for the game, I asked participants to think of a medium resource endowed household. And I think this quite accurately reflected what happens in a typical medium resource endowed household in this community. So I think this game really served to unravel what happens, but the question is, in a high resource endowed household or a low resource, it might look very different. There's also something that I'm mentioning in my discussion, where I'm talking about patterns of power distribution in different households. So that low resource endowed households, they are so concerned with food security, and food security is the task of the man. And so the women usually don't get land, and the young also don't get. So it seems like the power is more pooled, even stronger pooled around the household head. And then when you are medium resource endowed, you also allocate land maybe to the wife and the son, and then they also take part in the negotiation because you need their labor, and so you also give them something. So
that brings me, if I have time, Mr. Director, to another question, indeed, about chapter 5, where you conclude that even if people indicate that there is some power sharing and division of power, eventually household heads decide without making a compromise, right?
That's what it looked like, yeah.
And you discuss possible explanations. Well, I find the withholding power explanation most plausible, and I interpret it a little bit to mean as a little bit like choose your battles. If you give your husband, for example, his way in doing the land allocation and choosing the crops, then I will get something in return, maybe in another domain,
right.
The school fees or clothing or. And then I looked at your Annex 5, how you had operationalized this whole power idea. I mean, I commend you trying to come to grips with it, but it only the whole power idea only focuses on decision making about land allocation and crops. And well, this whole withholding power idea suggests, there may be all sorts of other domains. There's also something like not only, whether people can make decisions, but also whether people can make sanctions. I think women can stop cooking or speaking or having sex, or there's all sorts of resources that people can mobilize. So you have a very crude, narrow sort of operationalization of power. If you had to do this again, so how would you do it in the same way? Would you try to operationalize power in a different way?
So power, from my side, was only defined as the influence people have on a particular decision, indeed. And I was thinking, because on one hand, it's not satisfactory because decisions are more complex. So, for example, I chose land because that was more simple than the technology packages. But then land seemed, again, too complex because there are relations between different crops. So how simple do we have to make it in order
different
to actually...
domains.
In different domains, exactly. I mean, I think what I wanted is to have an idea how it works, and now, I mean, I could describe it in the paper, but I didn't know beforehand. So I think it was very useful to keep it extremely simple at this point. Now, if I would go further, I would rather say I would try to get more observations to really see if these patterns are valid also elsewhere, and so I would keep it the same, I think, because I wouldn't know what I. Or you mean that now with my knowledge I go to another site and I have to investigate?
Well, if you do this hypothesis to, withholding power, how would you test it or...
Actually, I feel that I saw that in the game. Because I also, one of my annexes is the video, the actual video, and you can see that the household head gives the floor, although he could make the decision. So that is, for me, there are signs of people withholding power, or even sometimes acting or standing up for someone else, for the interests of the other person. That's probably an example for using power for someone else, but you could actually observe that during the game.
Okay, so you place the withholding power at the household head. I was sort of interpreting it, the withholding power at the women's side, for example, or the...
Also, anybody can withhold power. Yeah. In this case of the game, I was surprised to see that the household head was withholding power.
Okay, and I read it as if the women were withholding power. But I think I shall stop here and move on. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lewis. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Kizito, Chief Scientist of IITA in Tamale in Ghana.
Thank you very much, Chair and respected candidate. It was a pleasure reading over your work. It was quite an effort put into this, and great to see the discourse going on in terms of diversity of farmers, as well as, the interplay, like my colleague here has mentioned. I just wanted to dive right in. Given the fact that there is quite a bit of diversity within the farms and farmers, if you really wanted to create a scenario for future evolution of these farms in northern Ghana, could you walk me through what institutional governance issues you see that could come into play that could potentially paint a different picture for the future?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you so much for your words and also for your question. Could you please elaborate what you mean with governance?
Yes. Because there is a time when there were issues related to choices of inputs. In the chapter you say the choices related to inputs in terms of what crops you grow where, but there was no explicit mention of things like, what does the political climate play into this, and institutions. So I just wanted to clarify on that, whether you saw any dynamics related to that.
I see. So you mean governance at national or regional level influencing the farmers. Yeah. So actually, yes, I realized later during my work that I'm really focusing on the farmer's perspective. And so, for example, there may be subsidies. If they don't reach the farmers, I wouldn't consider them, basically, because I'm so much looking at the farmer's perspective. It's not available. But I know that at the moment, the government of Ghana has an initiative. It's called Planting for Food and Jobs, I think. And they are subsidizing, again, fertilizers. And so they want to improve the access of farmers to input and also output markets. So I can imagine that this can influence
Correct.
farmers.
And actually, the reasoning behind that question, I had that policy into perspective, mainly planting food for jobs, because even the best of interventions at the smallholder level could go south or the other way around, mainly because of those other, I call, exogenous factors that are really out of the control of the farmers.
Yeah, so I don't know actually how well it's working, and I also don't know how well the government is doing and whom they're actually reaching. From the farmers, I know, like at least the moments that I worked with them, many of them, it didn't reach many of the farmers, so it basically didn't exist for them.
Okay, good. Maybe as a follow-up, there is a place in the thesis where you mentioned that the dynamic nature of agriculture which actually guarantees that typologies will eventually expire at one point. That was quoted by Armitage 2006. I was just curious whether you really see this as a fleeting snapshot, even for your work. Maybe again to follow up, do you see the relevance of this work in providing guidance towards donors to invest in these smallholder systems, or do you see it as just a snapshot in time?
It sounds to me like two different questions, like whether it's worth to invest, but about the typology and the validity. So in the first chapters, we've been quite specific. Like very specific cut-off points for what defines a certain type of farmer. What I did in my chapter 4, where I took it to the technology packages, because I was aware that, for example, IFPRI was also building a typology based on the GARBIS data, the Ghana Africa Rising Baseline Survey, and I knew that they were also classifying farmers according to resource endowment. And I wanted to make my work relevant to our previous efforts, the very specific, but also to the higher level and the other typology. So I kept it very general. That's also what I'm describing in my chapter 4, that actually I'm just saying low, medium, and high resource endowed, and there are different cutoff points for the communities, and I think for every community that you work in, you could choose a different cutoff point to have it valid. I think that will not expire very quickly.
Okay, that's fair enough. I was just curious also, in figure 1.3, which was really portraying very well on page 26, you contextualize a three-step process for research for development, where there's a problem, and then you speak about a solution, and there's implementation somewhere. You did mention two aspects in relation to implementation. There was an aspect related to accessibility, if it's accessible, and if it's affordable, then chances are, yes, there would be implementation. Do you think that issues related to acceptability play a critical role within these kinds of systems in northern Ghana? I'm thinking mainly social cultural norms, yeah.
I think they do. That's what I expected. For example, I know that in so they have these compound fields right around the household, and in some communities you're only allowed to grow, like culturally allowed to grow millet or something. Like we couldn't suggest to put something else there. So there are cultural constraints to it. About acceptability, I've also included that criterion in my farmer evaluation in chapter 4. And I didn't find that farmers were using this criterion a lot. No. So of course the question whether we had the same understanding of this criterion, but it was rather the high resource endowed households that said it's rather not acceptable because they felt that low resource endowed farmers get supported while they don't get a proportional amount of help themselves. We can argue, of course, if they need it, but it felt rather unfair, at least to one of the farmers. He mentioned that very strongly.
Okay. Great. Now that you talk about resource endowment, I wanted to change gears a little bit and switch to the portion where you were speaking about the maize ratio and legume ratios, which had strong negative correlation to each other. And that's valid. It's not very surprising. And in that context, you said where large areas of maize are dedicated to growing, then it's at the expense of legumes. In the context of northern Ghana, type 5 and type 6 of your typologies are the low resource endowed farmers. Because they typically have low resources, their maize ratio was much higher than the others. Would you say that these are food secure? Because maize is a staple. Would you conclude that these households are food secure?
So it's a very one-sided diet in a way, but they need to make sure that they have the main staple. Maybe it's also the household head. Again, low resource endowed households are driven by decisions of the household head. His domain are the staple crops. So, right. And he really needs to make sure that there's enough of that. Otherwise, he basically failed, right? So I think that's why they are really taking most of the land for that.
Correct. What about from the nutritional context of things? Because the legume component was pretty small.
Not very well. I guess they are regulating it during the market. Maybe they get small quantities from the community in exchange.
Yes.
Yeah.
And if we flip the coin and go to the highly resourced farmers, we notice that they actually didn't really allocate a lot of land to maize as well, but they rather invested elsewhere, like in livestock.
Yeah.
Do you think that there is no impetus for, do you feel like there's no impetus for these people to reinvest back into agriculture, or do you think it has more to do with land scarcity for the area per se? Is that clear?
That they invest into livestock rather?
Yes, rather than land, because maybe the land is just not there for them to.
That's a good idea. I haven't thought about it.
I'm thinking about this in the context of the Upper East region.
Upper East.
Yeah.
They have relatively much land, at least I'm thinking of Nyango and comparing it with Duko. I think Duko is rather land constrained, Nyango has rather much. So your question was?
My question is, do you think that they do not have an impetus to invest back into agriculture because of it's a land-constrained environment, or do they rather invest back into livestock because they'll earn more from livestock anyway than invest back into land?
So I didn't see so much I wouldn't have separated land and livestock because I think they are rather investing, let's say, in machinery and businesses and also or input businesses. Like their businesses are revolving around agriculture, I think. Right. But I didn't think that livestock is it's a buffer maybe for their and it's a symbol of wealth as well. Sure. But as a business, like really moving, I think it's rather different.
So you didn't see them like they're moving out of agriculture, really?
I didn't perceive that.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kizito. The opposition will now be continued by Dr. Boudron, Senior Scientist of CIMMYT in Harare, Zimbabwe.
Thank you very much. Respected candidate, I really appreciated reading your PhD thesis. Very well written, very nice figures, really a pleasure to read. Of course, a lot of your work has been on typology, so perhaps I'd like to ask you a few questions on typologies. And what really shocked me initially going through the PhD thesis was really we have 3 chapters and 3 different typologies. We have a statistical typology in chapter 2, we have a participatory typology in chapter 3, and when we move to chapter 4, we have yet another typology, I would say an ad hoc semi-participatory typology. What does it tell us about typology? Are they useful, or do we, each time we have a question, we need to go back to do yet another typology? It's a lot of work, it's a lot of data. What's your take after all this work, after this PhD on typology and their usefulness?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your words and also for your question. Well, the aim of the typologies have not changed. They all address the same aim, which is understanding how farmers work and general farm diversity and concerning the technology packages. So we started with a statistical one, and then we wanted to confirm, basically, with the people, and that looked very different, so that was interesting enough to publish, so it's another chapter. And then, as I already described, I wanted to consolidate that in chapter 4, and I combined them. So basically the household diversity I described in the first chapter based on statistical techniques, and then the diversity within households I described with the participatory typology in chapter 3, and then I combined the two. And you can also see that in the chapter 4. There's this very simple figure. If I find, on page 111, where I basically just say there's horizontal and vertical diversity, yes, and then use that for my survey design. So I think it's not like I did a typology for a different purpose each time, but they were very complementary, and I try to explore what information I can get out of different approaches. In the end, choosing one that was most handy for the analysis. Okay.
Well, I believe like the main, you're talking of trying to combine the typologies together. I think like the main combinations that you have attempted to do is like table perhaps 7.1, page 198, where I think you try to put like the statistical and the participatory typology. But I'm a bit struck when looking at it, and one more time, all the cost involved in doing those typology, the meetings, the data collections, the PCA, the trees to cluster all this. couldn't you have done, obtained the same result just with a couple of meetings in a couple of hours with key informants and at a much lower cost for Africa Rising and whoever invest in research?
It's very valid, actually. I think the type of information that I'm presenting here in Table 7.1, I'm trying to simplify but also summarize everything that I've learned in the chapters. And indeed, I'm using the household and also the farmer diversity. And I do think as well that you can fill such a table quite quickly with the community, and this would be one of my recommendations as well, to use this kind of structure. I'm recommending that household or farm and farmer diversity should be considered. And you can already go quite far by just filling it with several community meetings. I would definitely agree with you.
Okay. Perhaps just again on typology, maybe more a methodological issue. Like if we look at your type 6 in figure 2.3, so page 46, I see like you've got, this type is only 3 household. So is it really, do you include that as a type, where you need a particular, basket of technology for this type, or are they just outliers? Does it warrant really a proper type with a proper specifications?
So actually, that relates also to my figure 2.3, also on page 46, where I can set different cutoff points. I could have decided to choose a higher cutoff point.
Would have gone for 4, yeah.
Exactly. You could have gone for 4, but then you would have, for example, merged type 2 and type 6. Yes. And if you look at them in the figure 2.4, you see that they are quite different. So we felt that we gain quite a lot by keeping them separate. That's how we decided on having 6 types.
Okay. Let me move to technologies now, the technologies that you consider. To me, it's a bit unclear why you considered so few technologies in Chapter 4, and only technologies aiming at increasing yield, especially when you look at your previous chapter, and I believe Table 2.3, where you mention the need for livestock technologies, resilience-building technologies, maybe labor-saving technologies. You identified a lot of other areas that seemed very interesting and promising in terms of technologies to really help those different types. So why ending up just with basically yield-increasing technologies at the end and exploring this in Chapter 4?
So I think there's also it's not just about yield; it's also about soil fertility. There are different components in the technology packages. But the reality, I'm calling them technology packages, but in fact, Africa Rising has done a lot of trials, and there are a lot of different varieties. But in order to evaluate something, you need a very clear reference basis. And this was my first attempt to tease out differences among households and household members. So I was searching for a very clear basis for evaluation. So I think it could have been also other technology packages. For example, I think Africa Rising also has livestock interventions. I could have looked at that.
That would have been nice, yeah.
Yeah, that would have been nice.
No, well, you say there are more than just yield-increasing technologies, but I can't find the table anymore. But to me, it's mainly like looking at varieties, and it's looking at fertilizers. So it seems like, the good old green revolution, the good package that we have done since the 70s and have not been adopted so much in Africa. I believe Africa Rising was about like sustainable intensification. So where is the sustainable aspect in this package of technologies that you've explored? It really looks like good old green revolution technologies, no?
Well, so when I joined Africa Rising, they had already done all kinds of needs assessments and with many communities, and they really tried to source from them what was in demand. And so I arrived and I found this trial data, and I worked with that. And yield increases are, you could say, important. I think there are other aspects like post-harvest losses. The project is also working on that, very important. And there are a lot of, when you talk about agroecological principles, they are very specific for specific places. So now I also needed packages that are comparable among the regions, and then we're talking about maize and cowpea and soybean, which are rather present in all the regions. So it's again
comparable for the research, or to really help the livelihood of the people as targeted to do.
In this case, it's something that I need to do for the research, to do an evaluation about the livelihoods of the people. I think they are, like, the feedback of the farmers was also very positive about these packages, and there are many more things that are done. These are not the only solutions. These are not the only things that make up a sustainable farm system. I agree with you. Yet I don't think these are bad technologies, for example.
Okay. Perhaps talking about resilience, because we are talking of, I guess in this dry environment, resilience is very important. And you made a statement in chapter 6 that, you talk about more resilience. But when I look, soil organic matter, you talked about fertility is also very important for resilience. But when I look at your figure 6.7, page 184, it seems all of them, it's a large panel, but the figure on the top left corner, all of them seems to decrease soil organic matter.
Seem to decrease what, sorry?
All your technologies are decreasing soil organic matter. It's a negative bar, no? So how can you qualify, why do you mention, I think it's a fundamental component of resilience. Mm-hmm. They decrease soil organic matter, so is it more resilience really, or how do you assess resilience in that case?
Just to clarify, these are not the technology packages. This is part of the game, and where farmers, you can see that.
But according to them, it will decrease their resilience then
No,
if the soil
with the farm design model, actually. This I calculated with the farm design model, and they are often negative. The soil organic
so is the model badly calibrated, or really that's predicting a decrease in soil organic matter?
Sorry, I couldn't hear.
Is the model badly calibrated, or really does it really predict something that will happen, which is a loss in soil organic matter?
Well, it also always depends how much people sell, and there might be organic matter sources that we're not considering, like livestock is free-ranging, or it's difficult sometimes to understand. But so I think the main statement that can be derived from here is that there's not much of a difference between soil organic matter performance, between the suggestion for farm configurations of the different household members. So that's the main message here in the table.
But always negative. If I have time for a last question, I think the entire PhD was built to inform Africa Rising, and you make a number of statements where you say like this typology is very important and will be used by Africa Rising, and this is very relevant for Africa Rising. So I'd like to know how your results, your finding, were used by Africa Rising. Were any of the typologies used really to target some of these technologies, or did it remain an academic exercise, basically?
First of all, I consider myself also part of Africa Rising. So the first typologies, I've used the typologies actually to evaluate the technology packages with the model with the farmers. So I think it was used in that sense. Some of my recommendations were, for example, looking at the affordability, and we started looking at microfinance. I'm not so sure if this is exactly the outcome of my results, but I saw things happening that matched with my recommendations. So I felt maybe it was useful that I did this exercise for programming of the project. Well, I would actually like to ask Fred and Irmgard also later how it was further used. Right now it's about scaling up technologies. So that's exactly what typologies can be used for too, but I'm not aware at the moment if they are actually doing it.
And especially which one of the three typology would be used for scaling up, because you might feel confused with three typologies. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Boudron. The opposition will now be continued by Dr. Sato, researcher of the Consumption and Healthy Lifestyles Group here at Wageningen University.
Thank you. Respected candidate, my warmest congratulations on the successful completion of your PhD thesis. And I've been looking at women's empowerment in development, as well as I also looked into inter-household dynamics within the farm household in northern Ghana, as you know. So I've learned a lot from your research as well. And I particularly like the serious game you used to kind of illuminate, which is usually closed curtain, right? The wall of household, what's happening within the household, we don't get to know usually. And I'm into this artistic method by myself, how to illuminate those aspects which are not illuminated in the normal, using normal research methods. So I seriously started thinking about using similar method in my research next time. So my question concerns women's empowerment. In a general discussion, in a subsection entitled Empowerment Debate in page 209, at the bottom of the first paragraph, you refer to Bacon's statement, knowledge is power, and you stated, I quote, I believe that ensuring truly equal opportunities, for example, equal access to training for all household members, has the potential to bring about important change. So, reading this paragraph till the end, this reminded me of the kind of popular trend in development, how investing in women's human capital as the kind of panacea for development, how investing in women, like invest cognitively, right? Giving like training to do economic activities and so on. Increase productivity of women in economic sense, and then that women multiply benefits, not only for themselves, but also for their family members and communities. And this has been heavily critiqued by feminist development scholars, and you didn't mention any of them, so I wonder whether you know any critique of this approach?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your words and also for your question. I'm not so aware. Maybe you can describe one of the critiques, then I can...
Yes, because women are not only productive agricultural laborers, but women also perform social reproductive labor, like household provisioning and care work. And you also mentioned many women are also traders, right? Exchanging and gaining kind of pocket money to buy household, like soup ingredients or supporting children to go to school. And so feminists have argued this investing human capital, women's human capital, will bring in like contradictory effects. Surely, like improving household nutrition status, or children are going to school, for example, but at the same time, their time poverty, like they're intensifying their labor, right? And time poverty has been increased, and also reproducing female altruism. Women are working for somebody else, right? Mm-hmm. And can we discuss this women's empowerment in one domain of agriculture, like land allocations, and keep ignoring these other aspects?
So that they will intensify their labor.
Because you didn't mention at all.
Yeah.
So.
I find it always difficult to make a judgment about other people's lives. Like, I think it is very valuable that they have the opportunity. Like, if you offer in training, I mean, it's only an invitation. So if they take it, it means that they have the space or they have the interest to take it. And then what happens next? It can only be an invitation. I mean, if we would recommend something specific and then it has negative consequences, we could say that we're kind of guilty, right? Mm-hmm. So I think there can be negative effects, and that's also what I'm mentioning in general, that we have to stay very close to the farmers' realities and ask them, okay, like really try to understand also the social system, and maybe you could actually assist and help forecast what happens if you do this. So it can be an informed decision. So this would be my best guess, which is also coming a little bit from my coaching background, where I'm also exploring possibilities with people, but it's never me advising something, but it's really having an open conversation, having a good feeling, and then sometimes some expert knowledge where you could offer something, but it's always up to them and their systemic knowledge to decide if something is good for them or not. Does this go into the direction of your question?
Yes. But looking at the time, I have one more question I would like to ask, and it's related to proposition number 4. I would like the proposition number 4 read aloud.
Participatory approaches in research for development should express that we participate in people's lives rather than people participating in our research.
Okay, so do you think that you took a participatory approach, right, through which you kind of participate in people's lives? If so, what kind of evidence can you tell us?
For me, it means that if I'm doing something relevant, where people are interested, and they will also come to me and take time and ask me about it. For example, sometimes my surveys were quite lengthy, and I was always impressed that they are staying, and that they kept being also interested in coming towards me and asking. So I feel this means that they allowed us, me and my colleagues, to participate in their lives. So that's, for example, a good indicator, I think.
Yeah, and also this question came to me because you looked into, right, by doing this conducting game theory, like you kind of show, like exposed what kind of dynamics actually happening within the household, right? And you also inquired the participants how what's played out in the game correspond to their realities, and most of them said yes. But at the same time, I wonder why you didn't actually ask, like you interpret it, right? And how, if we follow what the women and eldest son or son said, how they want to allocate the way they want to allocate the land, which will increase household nutrition status as well as profitability. But at the same time, as a kind of sociologist, I wonder why they did what they did, why you did not ask directly how they did what they did, and have them explain why they negotiated that way. But we are presented that your interpretation, but again, for me, the participants are kind of again spoken when you do so. Yeah. They are not participating in the analysis section, so they are part of the implementation processes and they participated, but you are the one who interpreted. That's how I felt. So if we are to conduct kind of truly or more truly participatory approach, wouldn't it be an idea to also invite them in the analysis section as well?
I feel that I've done that also in chapter 5. The chapter itself is very brief, but there's a big annex. For example, I'm asking people what would be their ideal area, the minimum and maximum area for certain crops, and I'm asking them why. And I also try to show patterns. So I want to know why. And also with the land allocation decisions of these individual groups and the spokesperson, I ask them what's the purpose of growing that, or growing exactly this amount, why not more, why not less. I captured all of that. Some of it is in the annex, and some, if there was a statistical relevance, statistical significance, differences between the different type of household members, then I reported that, I guess, also in the chapter 6. So I felt I've asked that because I also worked with a gender expert on this paper, so she was also definitely advising me to look behind their motivations.
Yeah. Okay, maybe I missed what you discussed in annex, but it's in annex, not in the main part of the paper, and I wanted to hear those aspects.
I think part of it is in the papers, but I'm not sure if I managed now to pinpoint that.
But I'm satisfied at the moment, so I will, because it's only 2 minutes left.
Okay.
Before one more question.
In that case, we move on. Thank you, Dr. Sato. I would like to give the floor to Dr. Groot, Associate Professor in the Farming Systems and Ecology Group at this university, for the final question.
Thank you, Mr. Rector. Respected candidate, I also congratulate you with finalizing your thesis. For my question, I would like to invite one of the paranymphs to read proposition number 7.
Introverts need more habitats on campus.
Thank you. Well, your proposition seems to suggest that introverts are in a way maybe a bit disadvantaged or held back. Could you explain why they need a special treatment, or what exactly is behind your reasoning behind this this proposition?
Highly esteemed co-promoter, thank you very much for your question. I'm an introvert, And I have shared the office with like 10 PhDs on a daily basis. And for me, introvert means that you get your energy from being on your own, while extrovert means that you can actually recharge in the presence of other people and exchanging. For me, it was extremely draining to sit in the open space office. Actually, sometimes for lunch, I went into the nature, into high grass, just to hide, like with my lunch companions, just to have a moment on my own. So I need more spaces like that.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this very clear answer. Thank you, Dr. Groot, for your question. I would now like to adjourn this meeting, and the committee will withdraw for consultation.
I totally forgot to announce something. You're, of course, all welcome. Downstairs, there will be a brief reception here in the aula, just a handshake thing, and we have some food there. But then I also reserved the Fremde Streken, which is just around the corner, so everyone is welcome. I know there's another defense of my colleague, Judith. Yeah, feel free to join her defense. We will probably be there afterwards again, still in Fremde Streken, so just feel free to join us there.
Please be seated. I hereby reopen this meeting. The Academic Board of Wageningen University, represented by the Deputy Rector Magnificus and 6 committee members appointed by the Academic Board, having noted the content of a thesis entitled On Smallholder Farm and Farmer Diversity, with propositions, having heard the defense of that thesis, has decided to confer the degree of doctor on Mirja Michalscheck, born in Eckenförde, Germany, on May the 28th, 1987, and to grant to her all rights and privileges ensuing from that doctorate by law and custom. The Academic Board assumes that you accept your duty as a scientist to execute your future research ethically and with due diligence, according to the Netherlands Code of Conduct for Good Scientific Practice. I'd now like to invite the promoter, Professor Dr. Tito Nel, to acquit himself of his duty.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Director. You have heard the decision of the Academic Board of Wageningen University to confer on you, Mirja Michalscheck, the degree of doctor. It is now my honor to present you with the degree, signed by the Deputy Rector Magnificus, the promoter and the co-promoter, and sealed with the Great Seal of Wageningen University. I will first invite you to sign the degree as well, and with this signature, you declare to act according to the Scientific Code of Conduct in the future. Allow me, Mr. Deputy Rector Magnificus, to offer my congratulations and to add a personal address. So, highly esteemed Dr. Michalscheck, dear Mirja, it is a great privilege and a pleasure to be the first person ever to address you with the newly acquired title of doctor, conferred on you by Wageningen University. I would like to congratulate you with your achievement, also on behalf of your co-promoter, Dr. Jeroen Groot. It is a great honor for me to have been playing a role at your supervision since you joined the group in 2014. In these congratulations, I would also like to include your family, parents here in the audience, and your friends who are now watching this ceremony through the internet, for sure, and your friends and colleagues present here in the audience. These congratulations are well deserved. You have worked hard to complete your PhD, alongside participating in different projects and international consulting through the FSC group, while making time to keep training yourself and maintaining your international network. You really worked hard and managed to complete your thesis within 4 years, in spite of several other commitments that you had within the different projects through which you were hired at FSC. You showed a great capacity to organize your time and efforts to the point of obliging your supervisors to keep pace with you. Your trajectory was not a typical one for a PhD student. You were first handpicked by Johannes Scholber, a former colleague of us, who saw your potential back in 2013. You were then not able to take up a position due to personal issues in the group, but then you joined us in 2014 as a junior research assistant to help with the Farming Systems Ecology Group deliver output for the Africa Rising project. So although you had the intention to do a PhD at some point, that was not the first reason why you joined the group. You work in projects for FSC all over the world, and after a time of observation, reflection, and experience, you came up with a proposal together with your supervisors to turn your insights and your questions into research objectives and hypotheses. And your daily work as a project officer became a PhD trajectory. This was highly demanding, and the funding was not always secure in the midterm, but you took up the challenge with much enthusiasm. You managed to obtain the necessary time and resources to conduct your research in the field, and you managed to get access to a broad set of expertise through collaborations with colleagues within and outside Wageningen University. I remember the day you arrived in Wageningen, we were formally introduced by Dr. Groot, And we sat down, we talked a few words, and I realized that facing such an unstructured professor and such a young and dynamic group was both challenging but also very stimulating to you. And after a period of adaptation, you really grew into it. Sorry that you had to sit in a common working space. Showed great commitment to the project and the group, and in many circumstances, you even acted as an ambassador to the FSC group in different international meetings. So we are also very grateful for that. The challenge that you took up during your thesis of aiming to understand intra and inter-household dynamics in the context of smallholder agriculture was a complicated one, not least for a person who does not necessarily speak the language of the local people where she works, as much as for the need to collate different sources of data, information, and methods. And that ranged from participatory research in the communities to mathematical modeling, gaming, discourse analysis, etc. Really very diverse. You always showed great enthusiasm as being challenged by having to learn and implement new methods, and by having to bridge theoretical thinking and research practice. You had to work in collaboration with experts from different disciplines, from field technicians to university professors, and you managed to integrate all that in the different chapters of your thesis. Learning all the methods you use in your thesis and all the other ones that were left out of your thesis was a great effort, and I believe also a great investment for your training in the future. In collaboration with a team of fellow young scientists, you analyzed the diversity of livelihood strategies, combining statistical and participatory methods. Then you zoomed into the diversity of decisions and power shares that take place in smallholder rural households, and then you analyzed how this affected land use decisions at farm level. You proposed different conceptual models to explain power shares and assess the impact that inter- and intra-household diversity had on the perception and potential adoption of sustainable intensification technologies, particularly those that were proposed by the African Rising Project. Not all of them, focusing mostly on agronomy. You operationalized these insights into the farm design model in order to explore land use and sustainable intensification options as seen from the perspective of different household members, especially from women and the youth. And you contrasted model results with farmer realities and documented the complexity of the latter, with very concrete situational examples. Finally, you developed a serious auto game in order to stimulate actual household level negotiation processes between male and female and old and young household members. You were able to unravel different types of trade-offs and interaction among them that take place during a negotiation and show that power could be either actively deployed, withheld, or passively overruled, depending on the decisions to be made and on the dynamics of the negotiation process. Your thesis has made a great contribution to our understanding of household-level decision-making that will certainly influence work of fellow researchers as well as design of development projects in the future. On a more personal note, when I look back at the process, the first words that come to mind are efficiency and commitment. Once, not long ago, somebody asked me, how is Mirja progressing with her PhD? And I think I told you this. And the first thing that came to mind was like a train, fast and steady. But then I was not completely correct. I was actually wrong, because you were making fast and steady progress, but not without reflection and creativity. Now that creativity shows up in the choice of methods as much as in the insights you draw from your research. And creativity shows up also in the design of your thesis, in the graphic design, in the photograph, in all these more artistic aspects that you have. So you actually managed to combine both good rhythm and efficiency with reflection and creativity. Sorry. So both Dr. Groot and myself would like to commend you on that. Farming system research was new to you when you joined the group, and it was a very steep learning curve, but you actually had an open mind and a strong determination, and you managed to carve interesting research within the African Rising Project. This is partly the result of being highly systematic. For example, we noticed that you make many, many notes everywhere, that you put post-its everywhere with questions and answers. So we find them in our pockets all the time. This comes from Mirja. So you organize the meetings in such a way that even your supervisors get very systematic, even organized, even efficient. So no doubt that you have a very strong drive. Sometimes it has to be moderated or virtually discouraged to protect your own health and your well-being. Yeah? And the day-to-day relation with your peers may also suffer from such strong commitment and dedication at times. But all this results from your core motivation to make the world a better place and to work with the people for whom the world is a most challenging place. I'm sure you will make great contributions during your career, which is now only started. I'm only not sure where in the world that will be. You've already seen a lot of it, working in Jordan, Pakistan, Somalia, and Egypt, and now in Ghana. So you work both as a consultant, also within the university project, so a wealth of experience already. I sincerely hope we can stay in touch and collaborate in the future now as colleagues. All your qualities and your effort resulted in a thesis with 5 research chapters, 2 of which have been already published, and 1 already submitted for publication. In a journal discussion, you integrate all these insights. So the committee agrees that you have written a valuable thesis that will certainly arouse the interest of the scientific community. That interest is already obvious from the publication of some of the chapters. The committee also agreed that you defended your thesis very well. Mirja, we admire your determination and your commitment very much. I'm proud to have played a part in your training as a scientist, and I'm also very proud to have done that in close collaboration with Dr. Groot, who has been a mentor to you in the different phases of your thesis. My sincere congratulations once again. Finally, I would like to thank the committee members for their efforts reviewing the thesis and preparing the examination. And this especially applies to Dr. Kisito and Dr. Bodron, who came all the way from Ghana and from Zimbabwe. So herewith, I give the word back to the Deputy Director, Magnificus.
Thank you, Professor Titonella. Now it's my pleasure to congratulate you with your new title. And I too would like to extend my congratulations to colleagues, friends, family members here in the aula or perhaps watching this ceremony through the internet. I can confirm that within this committee there was a lot of appreciation for your work, for the creativity of some of your approaches, especially the innovative way at which you looked at intra-household issues, the flow of your narrative throughout the chapters, and also the diversity of approaches that you have used to shed light on some very complex issues. You're now an alumnus of Wageningen University. I hope that you will stay in touch with us, with your former colleagues and co-workers. Even being an introvert, I hope to run into you again, because during our conversation later, a few days ago, you told us that you're interested in impact evaluation sort of work. That is exactly the sort of work that we do, so who knows. On behalf of the academic board, I too would like to thank the committee members for their willingness to evaluate the thesis and participate in the defense today, and especially committee members traveling across international borders to join us today. Thank you very much. And finally, thanks for the audience for showing up in large numbers and providing moral support. There will be an opportunity to congratulate the young doctor downstairs next minute.